guys, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the 1920s, and this is going to be part one of two videos that looks at the 1920s. And the way we're going to look at this is kind of looking at three specific trends or concepts that were going on during the 20s. So specifically, we're going to be looking at political conservatism, nativism, and clashing values. So today we're going to do trends 1 and 2. So you should have a sheet that looks like this. It says political conservatism in the middle. It's got the 4 boxes. And also this. It says nativism in the middle, box on the bottom, box on the top. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So political conservatism is a new trend that starts right after World War I, and it's really a reaction to the politics of the early 1900s. So let's think about where we've been. What have been the politics of the early 1900s? So we've had the Progressive Era, right? The Progressive Era is about business regulation. It is about social welfare, the government involvement in all of these things, big business, that sort of idea. Now remember, Wilson, who is a progressive, is also the person who got us into World War I, and a lot of people are really unhappy about that. So what we're going to see after Wilson's term in office, there's going to be kind of a switch where we swing from the left to the right a little bit. So in order to kind of talk about political conservatism, I have my good buddy Righty here. Righty is an elephant, right? So this is the symbol of the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, right? So Righty is going to sit right on my shoulder, as we talk through this today. So the characteristics of political conservatism really deal, like I said, with smaller government, less business regulation. They're very pro-business, but pro-business doing their own thing, right? Keeping a balanced budget, having this kind of idea of law and order. We're going to see that when we get to kind of the foreign policy stuff that they're doing. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And again, very similar to the Republican Party of today. So that's just kind of something that should be more familiar to you. So when we are looking at this, who are our presidents? So we start with this guy right here. This is Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding runs in 1921, and he runs on a return to normalcy kind of campaign. So let me tell you a little bit about Warren Harding. Warren Harding is a really likable guy. He's a really nice guy, very friendly. People really like him. He's very popular with the American people. He wins in a massive landslide. But here's the thing about Warren G. Harding. He's not a super intelligent guy. In fact, he was known to have said one time, as he was trying to make decisions, he's like, I'll have some person tell me this, and that sounds right, and then some person over here tells me the opposite, and that sounds right too. I just don't know what to do, right? So Warren Harding, nice guy, not the best president. Not a great decision maker. He kind of lets other people make the decisions for him, and that turns out pretty bad for him. So this idea of return to normalcy. First of all, normalcy is not a word until Warren G. Harding says it. He makes it a word. What he means by this return to normalcy, or a return to normal really, is this kind of idea of the simpler time before World War I. Before we got all, labor union, big industry and, all this kind of crazy progressive stuff. Let's go back to when things were a little bit easier, right? This was a popular idea. The war had taken a lot out of people, even though we were only in it for about 19 months. It still affected us pretty good. And so this was a pretty popular idea. So like I said, Warren Harding wins in a landslide. But because he is the kind of guy that is depending on his buddies to make the decisions for him, things are not going to go so well, right? So the other thing, again, about Warren Harding is he is pro-business. So that's another thing to make sure you know about him. So like I said, as Warren Harding is depending on other people, there are going to be some scandals that rock his campaign or his term in office. This is mostly because of a group known as the Ohio Gang. So these are some buddies of his from back home, right? And these guys were basically taking advantage of their friend, right? They would kind of run the presidency from behind the scenes, pulling the strings if Harding is a puppet, and kind of making decisions to benefit themselves. The biggest thing that comes out of this is the Teapot Dome scandal. So this is all about oil, all right? Teapot Dome is a place in Wyoming where there was a oil rig, and the oil reserve there was supposed to be for the U.S. Navy, right? So for the military. Well, one of Warren Harding's buddies, part of this Ohio gang and also a cabinet member, transfers the money from the oil reserve there from the Navy to the Department of the Interior and use it to bribe people. Well, as you can imagine, this was not the best idea, right? And Warren Harding, he had signed off on it, but apparently didn't know much about it, which with any other president, I probably wouldn't believe that. With Warren Harding, probably was true. He probably didn't know anything about it. He is known to have said that the worry that his buddies are up to something keeps him up at night, but he didn't know what they were up to. And so as the scandal is starting to come to light and people are starting to learn of it, Warren Harding goes on a trip to Alaska. And while he is there on his way home from Alaska, he has a massive heart attack and dies. So Warren Harding actually dies before news of the scandal comes out. There is this massive funeral processional like they hadn't seen since Abraham Lincoln. People are terribly upset. And then news of these scandals start to come out, and it really changes the public perception of Warren Harding. So this is going to be kind of a big deal in terms of his legacy as much as anything. But, of course, Warren Harding is dead, so his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, is going to become the next president. So Calvin Coolidge is probably the opposite of Warren Harding in every way, shape, and form. So he serves from 1923 to 1928, obviously also a Republican. Calvin Coolidge is you can even see it in this picture, very stony, right? He doesn't say a whole lot. He actually had the nickname Silent Cal. His campaign slogan when he ran in 1924 was "Keep Cool with Coolidge," because it's, again, this idea that he's very cool and collected, right? Wasn't known to say a whole lot, wasn't known to be a great conversationalist, but he's a pretty smart businessman. And that was really kind of his thing. He was known to have said the business of America is business. So that's what we're good at. We are good at business, right? So we need to make sure business is what keeps us afloat. And what he believed is a laissez-faire kind of policy towards business. This means hands-off, very little regulation of big business, letting them kind of run for themselves, do their own thing. He also believes in something called trickle-down economics. This is something that his Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Mellon, came up with. And so the idea behind trickle-down economics is that you cut taxes on the wealthy people in the country. And supposedly what will happen is if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they have more money to spend. And wealthy people are going to spend their money, right? And so as they spend money, it trickles down, right? So imagine a waterfall trickling down, right? So first it's going to go to business owners, and then it's going to go to the people who work for them, and then it's going to go to the sales clerks, and then it's going to go to the guy who sweeps the floor of the store, and eventually that money is going to trickle down, and everybody will have money, right? So there's a lot of tax cuts that are involved. This idea that we're trying to keep the money in the hands of the people who own it, very pro-capitalist idea, right? And this is something that is still used a lot today in terms of Republican policies. So that's kind of where Cal was in terms of his policies as president. I want to look really quickly at their foreign policy, and this is kind of something that they were both all about together. So the conservatives were the ones, remember, who are against the Treaty of Versailles. They're against the League of Nations. And part of that reason is because of isolationism. Basically, they said, we got dragged into this European conflict. We don't want to get dragged into other European conflicts. So they are not fans of the League of Nations, right? It is actually the Republicans who reject the League of Nations. And the idea being is that we don't want to be pulled into conflicts that have nothing to do with us. So America was really trying to isolate itself from foreign policy at this time. However, it didn't always work out so great. The other thing that they're trying to do is prevent another massive war. All right, so there are a couple ways that they try to do that. The first is the Washington Naval Conference. So this was a naval conference where several of the major world leaders from Britain and France and the United States met in D.C., and what they agreed on is a worldwide Navy reduction. So basically every country in the world agrees to cut their Navy. Right? The idea being that there won't be as many ships on the sea, which won't cause as many conflicts, can free up trade, that sort of idea. And so the hope is that we'll solve some of the issues that started World War I with trading and freedom of the seas and that sort of thing. The other one is kind of a silly one, at least I think. This is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact was another kind of similar idea where all of these world leaders get together and they say, we are no longer going to use war as a way to solve conflict, right? Essentially, what they did was outlawed war or made war illegal. Now, personally, that'd be great if war was illegal. Does it make a lot of common sense? Think about it. If there's a nation that really wants to invade another nation, what's going to stop them? Just saying it's illegal and that you can't do it? Oh, my bad, it's illegal. I guess I shouldn't invade Czechoslovakia. Oops. Of course not. Adolf Hitler, when he comes to power in Germany, he doesn't pay attention to this, right? It's kind of a silly thing. Sure, it's a good sentiment. It doesn't really work, right? The last thing that the conservatives are doing in this time is they want to try and get some of their money back, okay? So we lent Britain and France a lot of money at the beginning of World War I. Well, the problem is Britain and France are pretty much broke, right? However, there is a country that owes Britain and France money. Remember, Germany is supposed to pay reparations from the Treaty of Versailles, so they're supposed to pay money to Britain and France to pay back for the war. The problem is Germany's economy sucks even more than Britain and France's economy does. So really nobody has any money. And as Americans, we really kind of want our money back from Britain and France. So we start to try and collect our debts. They can't pay it. So they come up with this plan in order to get our money back from Britain and France. So what they decide to do is something called the Dawes Plan. Dawes refers to the man who came up with it. So the United States is going to lend money to Germany. We lend them enough money, low enough interest, they can repay Great Britain and France. Then Great Britain and France can repay their debts to the United States. So in the end, whose money do we end up getting from the repayment of those debts? Ours, right? We paid Germany, so Germany could pay Britain and France, so they could pay us, right? It seems kind of weird, and it is kind of weird. Once the stock market crashes at the end of the 1920s, we kind of cut this out. We're not going to be able to pay it. Germany ends up not being able to pay Britain and France back until the 1980s. It's almost 70 years after the end of the war. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. So that is our conservative policies here. The next trend that we're going to be looking at is nativism. So righty is going to go away now. And it's actually really convenient that I wore a red t-shirt today. Okay, because red is the color you need to associate with nativism. All right, I'm going to explain why in a few minutes. So just keep this in mind. The red shirt, pretty important for this trend. Okay, so think about, we should already know what nativism is. We talked about it in the Gilded Age, but just to remind you, nativism is this anti-immigrant feelings, this fear of foreigners, a word xenophobia you might hear used with it. That means fear of strangers. So this is kind of what's going on in the United States. So think about why this might be happening. Okay, what are some possible causes of nativism? It really kind of goes back to World War I, right? So this idea that we're being pulled into a war that doesn't have much to do with us. That's going to kind of trickle in through immigration and other things as well. And because of World War I, actually immigration really picked up after the war. Europe is devastated. They have to rebuild. Their economies are just terrible. So a lot of people are like, screw Europe, we're going to try and go make our way to America and see if we can make a better life for ourselves. Particularly Eastern Europe, again, we have a lot of Russian and Italian immigrants that come in during this time period, the Balkans region. So there's this new immigration that picks up. So that's the first cause. Of course, we also worry about job competition, and there is some just cause to that in this period. But there is also this major fear of communism. Communism is a really new thing in the world in 1919, right? So communism broke out in the Russian Revolution with the Bolsheviks coming to power. Remember, the Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin, and he established this new communist regime in Russia. And communism was a really kind of scary thing to a lot of Americans. They weren't thrilled about the idea, and they were really kind of worried about that falling into the United States. And there's a group of people in the United States who are associated with communism and socialism, and that is the labor unions, okay? So the fear of communism is a little bit more than just Russians. It's also labor unions. So think about like when we talked about the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. That was a labor union that was a little bit more radical. So we're kind of worried that labor unions are trying to kind of take over and do crazy things like that. So that's kind of where we are right now. So some of the effects of this nativist feeling. We start with the new KKK, the new Klan. So the Klan had kind of fallen out of favor in the Gilded Age, but with the rise in immigration, it starts to pick a little bit back up. And now it's not just African Americans, it's Eastern Europeans, Italians, Russians, Catholics, Jews, any kind of radical. Labor unions were another one that the KKK wasn't crazy about. Membership picked up a huge amount, over 4 to 5 million members of the KKK in the 1920s. And this is all over the country, not just in the South. So this is like a really big deal. If we look at this picture here, sorry, my nose itches. Ugh. Let's go there. Maybe that'll stop. If you look at this picture down here at the bottom, this is a march in Washington, D.C. So you see it's in front of the Capitol there in 1925. These guys may not look like the KKK you're used to because you notice their faces aren't covered. It was seen as a very patriotic thing to be in the Klan in this time period. And again, like I said, we talked about the Klan and the things that they were doing in the Gilded Age. They're still doing that kind of stuff, lynching and things like that. Lynching is huge in this period. So this is a really big deal. The next thing that we have here, this is a political cartoon. So you can see this guy is an immigrant. He's coming into the U.S. The immigrant restrictions are on the door. Well, the door's open. So is there any immigrant restriction? No, right? The title of the cartoon says close the gate. If we close the gate, that will be the restriction. So this immigrant, couple things about him let you know that we don't want him here. First of all, he says right on the back, undesirable, right? Also, his head is made out of what? So what will happen if he comes into the country? There's a lighted fuse on his head. It's basically saying that it's going to destroy the country, right? So this is just a very nativist cartoon. Just kind of let you know what some of those things that people were fearing in this period. The next effect that we have are the Palmer raids. So the Palmer was the attorney general in the United States at the time, and he was pretty nativist. He was not a guy you really wanted to mess with. To be fair, he had actually had an attempt on his life, but that doesn't really justify what he does. So he orders these illegal search and seizures on thousands of immigrants all over the country, mostly targeting Eastern European and Italian immigrants. The idea is he is trying to root out communists, the radicals, right? So over 4,000 people were suspected of communism, being a communist, were arrested and thrown into jail, right, just for their political beliefs. Most of them never see trial. They are eventually released. But this is, kind of imagine the fear that this would have if you were an Italian, you spoke very little English, but you knew this was happening. You might be arrested for no reason just because you were Italian, right? This is kind of a scary thing for a lot of immigrants at the time. The other effect that we have here is the Immigration Quota Act. So this is a law that was passed by the Republican government that limited immigration into the country. So basically what they did is they set numbers. So we would only take in this many people from this country and this many people from this country. But it's a pretty biased law. More people, for example, could come in from England than Italy. So we might say that, well, we'll take 1,000 immigrants this year from England, but only 100 from Italy. What's the difference between England and Italy, right? Well, Italians are Catholic. Their skin is a little darker. They don't speak English, right? They're basically not like Americans, and a lot of people didn't really like that. And so they were trying to kind of limit the number of different immigrants that would come in. And we've seen this a lot with immigration. So kind of going along with this, I want to tell you specifically about a trial that took place. This is the Sacco and Vanzetti case. So these two men down here, Sacco and Vanzetti, were two Italian immigrants, spoke very little English, and they were both arrested after there was a break-in at a shoe factory and a man was killed. They were charged with the robbery and the murder of this man. Now, these guys, like I said, could barely speak English. There was very little evidence against them. It was, at best circumstantial, at worst, there was none. Like it was made up, basically. And these guys can't defend themselves. They can barely get a lawyer. They're Italian immigrants, right? So these guys are pretty much dead on arrival, right? So they are convicted of the murder and they are both executed for it. It kind of comes out later that there was evidence tampering. It also kind of comes out that maybe they were targeted, and a lot of people actually felt like this at the time. They were targeted because, one, they were Italian, they were immigrants, and two, they were known anarchists. So an anarchist is somebody who doesn't believe in government at all. That's seen as really radical at this time period, really chaotic, right? So this is a major deal. If you look, here is a photograph of some people who were protesting. So you can see, they're innocent men, they shall not be murdered. You can see over here, they're from the American Federation of Labor. So that's the labor union, right? And it was pretty big miscarriage of justice in this time period. And like I said, they were probably only arrested on the evidence that they were anarchists. It comes out later, like I said, that one of them for sure was absolutely innocent. One of them might have been involved, but there's not enough evidence to prove it. The last thing I want you to talk about here are labor unions themselves. Okay, so here's another political cartoon. See the guy at the top? He's a labor union, right? He sees labor written on his pants. So what's the first step if you join a union? Well, the first step is a strike, a walkout, right? That's not a big deal, except that strikes and walkouts lead to the next step, disorder, riots. And that leads to the next step, Bolshevism, communism, murder. That leads to the next step, chaos. And below chaos, who knows, right? So this is intending to kind of fuel that fire of fear of labor unions here. So a couple things to understand about labor unions. So there's a high inflation during the 1920s. This is an increase in the value or a decrease in the value of money. This causes a lot of strikes. So in the past, we saw Roosevelt set this precedent of the federal government supporting the labor unions. That is not what happened in this time period. The strikes are broken up by law enforcement. That's kind of this law and order type thing that we were talking about. A lot of men were fired completely. There was no, they would just get rid of everybody that was in the labor union, just fire everybody just because they were in a union. Today, that you cannot do that. That is illegal. That's one of the protections you have as a union worker. But those protections were not there at the time. This also kind of leads to this idea of the Red Scare. So I told you we were going to come back to this red, right? So red is the color of the Communist Party. Think about in the Russian Revolution, if you think back to world history, you had your reds and your whites. The Mensheviks were the whites. The Bolsheviks were the reds. The Bolsheviks were the Communist Party. They're the ones that came into power. So red is the color of communism, okay? So people called this the Red Scare because we were afraid of the Reds or the commies, right? So this is a fear of radicals and communists all over the country. And I think you've seen this idea. Think back to that political cartoon I just showed you on the last slide, that people are terrified. What are they so afraid of, right? Why in the world would they be afraid of anarchists and communists and socialists, right? So there are a couple reasons. One, they worry that it threatens the free market, the capitalist economic system that we have here in America. They're worried that, we would have too much regulation on business or all regulation on business. But they're also kind of worried that there's this plot to overthrow the government. Think about what the communists did in Russia, right? They overthrew the government. They killed the Tsar and his entire family, right? So what if that happened here? They don't want that to happen here. America's the best country in the world. Democracy is the best. Why would we want to get rid of that? So there's this kind of real paranoia about communism, and it doesn't really go away until like the 80s and 90s. It's something that sticks around. So the Red Scare, okay, again, red t-shirt, that's something you really need to kind of associate with labor unions, with immigrants, especially Russian immigrants. So that's kind of where we are. We will pick back up in the next video on cultural clashes. That is trend 3. But for now, I'll see you in class. Bye.